rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the sleek glass windows of Alexander Carter's luxurious penthouse. Inside, surrounded by priceless art and expensive furniture, Alexander lounged on his leather couch, sipping his evening whiskey. He was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and a reputation that made people either respect or fear him. Yet, despite his riches, he had little patience for anything that disrupted his orderly world. That was precisely why he was furious tonight. Standing in his grand living room, drenched from head to toe, was a young woman who looked like she barely belonged in the same world as him. Her clothes were tattered, her face smeared with dirt, and her shivering hands clutched a thin, torn blanket. She was a beggar, a nobody, someone he would never have spared a second glance at. And yet, fate had forced him to take her in. How long do I have to put up with this? Alexander asked sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. The old lawyer beside him, Mr. Whitmore, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Until further notice, the contract is clear, Mr. Carter. You agreed to follow your grandfather's last wishes, and this was his final condition. Alexander clenched his jaw. His grandfather, the only man he had ever looked up to, had left behind a shocking clause in his will. If Alexander wanted to inherit the remainder of his vast fortune, he had to take this beggar into his home and care for her as if she were family. No questions asked. It was absurd. His gaze flickered back to the girl. She stood silently, eyes cast downward, as if she knew she was unwanted. There was something strange about her presence, something unsettling. But he didn't have time to waste figuring out what it was. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Then louder, he barked. "Fine, you can stay, but don't expect any special treatment. You'll sleep in the guest room, eat when the staff eats, and stay out of my way." The girl finally looked up at him, and in that moment, Alexander felt something shift. Her eyes, they were oddly familiar. A spark of recognition flickered in his mind, but he couldn't place it. He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. All that mattered was surviving this ridiculous arrangement and making sure she left as soon as possible. But what Alexander didn't know was that this woman wasn't just some beggar off the street. She had a past that was deeply connected to him. And soon he would discover the truth, a truth that would change his life forever. The days that followed were tense. The mansion, usually a space of order and silence, now felt different, disturbed. Alexander went about his routine, trying to ignore the presence of the girl who had invaded his world. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if she feared saying too much. The staff didn't know what to make of her. They whispered among themselves, wondering why their ruthless boss had suddenly taken in a beggar. Some speculated that she was his secret lover, others thought she might be blackmailing him, but the truth was far more complicated. Alexander refused to acknowledge her beyond the necessary interactions. He had assigned her a room in the farthest wing of the house, away from his own, and given strict instructions that she was to stay out of his way. But no matter how much he tried to ignore her, something about her gnawed at him. One evening, as he passed the hallway leading to her room, he caught sight of her through the slightly open door. She was sitting by the window, staring outside, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he stopped to observe her. There was something eerily familiar about her. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it didn't match the image of a beggar he had in his mind. Despite her worn-out clothes, there was an air of quiet dignity about her. It unsettled him. That night, Alexander found himself in his grandfather's study, staring at the old man's portrait above the fireplace. He had always admired his grandfather's sharp mind and ability to read people. But why had he done this? Why force a complete stranger into his home? Mr. Whitmore, the family lawyer, had told him very little about the girl. All he had said was that she was important, that she was connected to something his grandfather had left behind. But how? Determined to get answers, Alexander decided to confront her. The next morning, he found her sitting in the garden, watching the housekeepers tend to the flowers. He approached her with his usual cold expression. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly. She looked up at him, those familiar eyes piercing through him once again. "My name is Emily," she said simply. "That's not what I asked." he said. "I want to know why my grandfather left you in his will. What is your connection to him?" She hesitated. A flicker of emotion crossed her face. Pain, sadness, something else he couldn't quite place. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "All I was told was that he wanted me to be here, that he wanted you to take care of me." Her answer frustrated him. It made no sense. His grandfather had been many things, wise, strategic, even a little eccentric, but he was never reckless. He never made decisions without a reason. As the days passed, Alexander found himself watching Emily more closely. The way she carried herself, the way she responded to things, it was as if she had been raised with a certain level of grace, yet had fallen into hardship. She didn't behave like someone who had spent years on the streets. She knew how to hold a fork properly at the dining table. She never seemed overwhelmed by the luxury of the mansion. One night, curiosity got the best of him. He called Mr. Whitmore, demanding answers. "There's something you're not telling me," Alexander said. "Who is she? What aren't you saying?" The lawyer was silent for a moment. Then, in a careful voice, he said, "Some truths are meant to be discovered, Mr. Carter. Perhaps you should look into your own family's past." Alexander's frustration deepened. What was Whitmore hiding? What was his grandfather hiding? Unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, Alexander began investigating. He searched through his grandfather's old documents, looking for anything that might explain Emily's presence. And then he found it, an old photograph, a picture of his grandfather standing beside a little girl with strikingly familiar eyes. Emily's eyes! The realization hit him like a wave. This girl wasn't just a beggar. She was someone who had been part of his family's past, and for some reason she had been erased from it. But why? As he held the photograph in his hands, his mind raced with possibilities. Was she a long-lost relative? A hidden heir? Someone his grandfather had wronged? One thing was certain. Emily wasn't here by accident, and whatever the truth was, it was about to change everything. Alexander stared at the photograph in his hands, his pulse quickening. The resemblance was undeniable. The little girl in the picture was Emily. But how? Why had his grandfather never mentioned her? And why had she been erased from their families? History! Determined to uncover the truth, Alexander confronted Mr. Whitmore again. This time, he refused to take no for an answer. The old lawyer sighed, as if carrying a burden he had long wished to put down. "Your grandfather made a mistake," Whitmore admitted. "A mistake that cost an innocent child everything." Alexander listened, in stunned silence as Whitmore revealed the truth. Decades ago, his grandfather had a falling out with his own younger brother. A bitter business dispute had turned into a family feud, leading to an irreversible split. His grandfather, being the powerful and ruthless man he was, had cut his brother off entirely, ensuring that no part of the Carter wealth or name would ever reach him or his descendants. Emily was one of those descendants. Her father, Alexander's great-uncle, had struggled to survive after being cast out. Life had been cruel, forcing him into hardship, and when he passed away, Emily had been left with nothing. She had no idea who she truly was, no idea she had come from a family of immense wealth. She had grown up in shelters and on the streets, unaware that the very man who had abandoned her father had also been watching her from afar, filled with guilt he never expressed. In his final years, Alexander's grandfather had tried to right his wrongs. He had left behind the clause in his will, forcing Alexander to take Emily in, hoping that the family would mend what had been broken, but the truth felt like a punch to the gut. Alexander had spent weeks looking down on Emily, treating her as a burden. And all along, she had been family. When he finally faced her, he didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. Would it have made a difference? She asked. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that if he had known the truth, he would have treated her better. But deep down, he wasn't sure. He had been raised to value wealth, power, and reputation above all else. And yet, standing here now, none of it seemed to matter as much as the guilt weighing on his chest. "I can't change what happened," he finally said. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to fix this. Properly." Emily didn't respond right away. She had spent her whole life being unwanted, unseen. Trusting someone like Alexander, someone who had once dismissed her, wasn't easy. But there was something in his voice, something genuine. "I don't need your money," she said softly. "I just want to know who I am, where I come from." For the first time, Alexander realized that wealth wasn't the answer to everything. Family, connection, and truth, those were the things that mattered. Over time, things changed. Slowly, awkwardly at first, but changed nonetheless. Alexander made an effort to include Emily in his life, not just as an obligation, but as family. He showed her the stories, the history of their ancestors. She shared parts of herself too, things she had never been able to tell anyone. And little by little, the mansion that once felt so cold became a home, not just for him, but for her too. His grandfather's last wish had forced him to see beyond money and power. And in the end, it wasn't an inheritance that changed his life. It was Emily,